Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rob Berry from Surrey Sussex Academic Health Science Network. I'm the Head of Innovation. I'm one of me in 15 academic health science networks that cover England. We lead locally on our engagement with industry or innovators, but work collectively across the national network to share ideas, to share processes, so that we work in a similar-ish way. And also at the right time that we can share innovators between us, those that we think might be more suited to other AHSNs or are ready for other AHSNs. Today is part of a series of engagement events. With the exception of the last 12 months, these will typically take place every 3 or 4 months and will be an opportunity for hearing updates about the wider innovation landscape, as well as any changes to how academic health science networks are working. The aim of this is to make sure that innovators have the opportunity to engage with AHSNs and know what's on, what's available, what support is available to you, and how and why you might need to be supported. I'm going to cover in more detail the specifics of what academic health science networks provide in terms of the sort of breadth of the AHSN support. Particularly focusing on how to get accelerated uptake, and to do that, why real-world validation is important, and in order to do real-world validation well, why your clear value proposition is important. So there's going to be 2 main focus points for today. Rachael Troughton from the AAC, the Accelerated Access Collaborative, will then talk about the wider offering and how services are being developed to support access to the wider innovation landscape. Just to give a sense of the scale of operation across academic health science networks. So for the last couple of years, we've seen similar figures, approximately 2,500 companies. A lot of this work is on one-to-one sessions, bar events like today. You will see most of our work is one-to-one, and you can see the middle figure there is a number of thousand of interactions. Not everyone will continue to get one-to-one support. There is a degree of selection in, which I'll talk about later. But you can see on the right-hand side there, 150, I think previous year, something like 200 companies are in long-term relationship with academic health science networks. I've been working quite closely with AHSNs for 2 or more years. We're very focused on what we might say are the economic growth side of things, which is related to health benefits, but often these are proxies for future health gain or health system efficiency gain. We're looking at jobs created and investment, and these are the sorts of figures that on a typical year we've been able to support innovators to achieve. So what's this all about? What are we trying to support? What's the issues that we're focusing on? So fundamentally, the NHS is often not what people expect. And by the way, these slides do have quite a lot of words. It's intended that you'll get these afterwards so that you can keep them as a reference for your future engagement with AHSNs. I won't be reading them out verbatim though. So there are challenges about how you engage and understand the NHS. Often the NHS in itself is a large beast and can give mixed messages. So sometimes we end up with the consequences of this challenge and the mixed messages. And how you might have engaged previously is that you may end up developing a product or believing that your product has greater value than it really does, and that at some point in the future you may end up feeling that you haven't achieved what you should have done. Most of these issues that you are going to face are foreseeable. This is based on years of our experience of supporting academic health science innovators, and also is backed up by research, and that most of these issues we now know can be predicted. So we've developed a series of interventions that we believe help ultimately for innovators that continue through the process to get that accelerated uptake. Primarily, we're looking for interventions that have a future potential for scale up. So we are looking for those stars, and that does mean there is a degree of selection. Not everyone will get support all the way through, Clearly those innovations, interventions that have greatest value are going to progress more quickly, and those that are not may get less support. As I've indicated earlier, a key element of the pre-scale-up work is you're rounding off of the evidence, what we would call a validation or real-world validation, demonstrating that the benefits you claim that can be achieved are actually achieved. And this is around giving other buyers, users, the confidence to also engage and adopt your product. Linked to that is we're typically engaged in the later stages of that evidence and insight gathering. For earlier stages, we are more likely to be doing light touch work and referring you to other agencies such as the National Institute of Health Research, NICE, and others who may be involved in more early stage support. Importantly though, an early intervention with us, and typically how most AHSNs will support you from the off, is to understand what the claims are that you're stating. So your value proposition, and we'll talk about this in more detail later on. What is it you've got? Because if you're not clear about what it is you've got, what it means to the buyer and the user, then how will you know that you're going to gather the right evidence that will help you ultimately to scale up? Importantly, particularly from the commercial teams in each of the AHSNs, through your journey, there is that ongoing business support. So you might hear about it being referenced as signposting. Actually, that's the least sort of value-added part, is pointing you in the direction of someone else. But most of the AHSNs will provide you with some business support, looking at your business plan, helping you to plan your business. The impact of this, well, we have already seen that innovators in particular appreciate that early warning of what might be a risk to their business. And through that early warning, the awareness of what they may not have known typically is the opportunity to adjust, whether that might mean targeting different or subgroups of patients, or whether it might mean changing their whole business model. So it gives you time to adjust rather than what we're going to come on to, what we describe more risky business is waiting until you get onto market before you discover those issues yourself. So that sort of risky behaviour that I've just mentioned. The higher risk behaviour we see as people who may have an inkling of how desirable their product might be or an intervention might be, and focus almost exclusively, that blue line, through the journey of development and testing. Only when they're getting close to market with their final product, or what they believe is the final product, are they checking around the desirability of that intervention, and as a consequence of that viability, only really late on discovering whether or not they have a viable business. Our process is really just saying, think about the desirability and check you have a viable business much earlier. That's the essence of what we're doing and how we wish to support you. Easy to say, so we know that if we talk to innovators, they'll say, yes, an early fail is good. Actually, what we also find is it's never taken that well. There's always a lot of discussion about it. And a lot of that comes down to really understanding the NHS and the NHS understanding innovators. So there is this inherent tension. We expect and appreciate that companies wish to get to market as quickly as possible. Time is money. If you run out of your money, run out of resource, your company may not continue to survive. So you are under pressure to get to market. Similarly, whilst both parties, the NHS and innovators, are interested in patient or health system benefits and want them, the NHS will be also looking after its business, and more particularly patient safety. So this sort of tension of getting to market as quickly as possible versus getting to market as safely as possible. And that does give rise to this sort of sense of innovators overclaiming and the NHS being risk averse. But once you stand back from that and look at it, I think hopefully you'll appreciate this is a process they have to go through. So let's talk a little bit about understanding the NHS. The NHS for the last 30 years has had a very decentralised approach. stimulating local organisations to own their own business by demonstrating that they have good governance and in particular good financial governance. So they've earned their autonomy. However, those organisations typically do not cover a whole pathway. They may cover secondary care, acute trusts, it might be part of a primary care, it might be a GP practice, or separately again, it might be a community or mental health. So they all have their own focus around their own organisational efficiency, but then no one currently is owning the whole system. You may be aware of moves by Simon Stevens to bring together integrated care systems, and exactly how that plays through might affect how much benefit we get from that. Similarly, the way that those individual organisations pre-pandemic were funded was quite different. We have seen an emergency case of everyone being in essence on a block contract, and that block contract, if it persists, might also change how the NHS behaves. So parking that aside as some unknowns for the moment, let's just look at the high level sort of numbers in the NHS. So those independent organisations, of which there are many hundreds, or if you're including GP practices, many thousands. And in each organisation, as you develop your product, you will probably have to engage with multiple people per organisation. So just to give you a sense of the numbers of people, and therefore an indication of the challenge of engaging with, particularly at the moment, busy healthcare workers, whether of whatever profession, and a lot of that may be multi-professional engagement. We're often asked, what are those high-level priorities? Or even what are the priorities? And it's quite difficult to say what at any one stage the priorities are. It's usually going to be a portfolio of priorities. But at the highest level, patient safety. So if you have something that's truly patient safety orientated, then that will be the #1 priority, and it will trump finance. And the way this will typically play out in a provider organisation is that if they have a cost that's necessary to address a patient safety issue, that financial burden that arises from that will have to be spread across other services. So patient safety first, and by that we mean truly patient safety, not just improved outcomes. Secondly, though, is that autonomy has come from demonstrating financial control. So finance is fundamentally the second most important thing. So although you will hear how patient-centred everyone is in the NHS, which they are, they also have to balance the patient interest with, and new developments with, balancing the books. And then in reality, there are tens, possibly many tens of other priorities, which will, as an organisation, they'll have their own portfolio. And those portfolios of priorities will be different, which I'll try and help explain now. We think it's helpful to assume that the NHS is different everywhere. On the left-hand side is a map taken from the Atlas of Variation. I think the clue's in the name. There are a variety, tens, possibly 100 or so maps, and it shows how by different specialty outcomes vary, and those outcomes in those clinical areas will be driving decisions in those organisations. So where there are reds, if you are managing that organisation, you're more likely to be driven by where are those reds that you need to address to make them amber, if not green. So that's one aspect of decision making people will be looking at. And if, rather than trying to find these maps, which you can do if you Google Atlas of Variation and getting it right first time, there are many maps, but not individual organisations won't be red at everything or green at everything. They'll have a variety of reds and greens, and probably not enough funding to cover off all of their reds. So they will be making choices about those reds. Then if we look in the middle section, there's a variety of environmental factors that may affect how those benefits will play out to those individual organisations, and possibly how big the problem is in the first place. So a mixture of what's their current local practice through to what's their staffing issues like, and a range of other factors. So that might be different everywhere. And then lastly, on the right-hand side, this is a map, slightly old, There are some white areas there representing underspend, and the darker red being the more overspent. Probably more overspent generally now, but again, you can see available finance may vary. So those three factors themselves are likely to lead to a highly varied response to any one intervention. I'm just noticing that so far there are no questions. Usually it's round about this time we start to get some questions. So let's focus a little bit on finance. So we often have companies will come to us and say that their product has demonstrated cost effectiveness. In some markets, and potentially in the more true market where patients pay for the services themselves as opposed to a state-funded system, being cost effective on its own may work. But in the NHS or state-funded systems where there's a limit on the cash availability, what's in the operational budget may mean that in spite of something being cost effective, it may not be affordable, and therefore cost effectiveness is not the same, not always the same or guaranteed to mean it's affordable. And there are other issues you can then look at around that. So in terms of particularly around how resources might be freed up through your intervention may determine whether or not cost effectiveness translates into affordability. One of the main issues around that is going to be affordability, where you believe you're going to deal with a queue of patients differently. And I think the queue on the collective queue reported in the press today was something like 4.5 million patients waiting for interventions. So let's assume that most services have a queue. If that activity is in a queue and you start to remove some of that activity because of your intervention is helping in inefficiency or triaging differently or just managing differently, if you only remove part of the queue is still being serviced. And if you haven't planned to take out resources, then that queue will not result, that intervention will not necessarily result in a release of resources that you might be reliant on, or the organisation might need to demonstrate in order that it can afford the intervention you're offering to them. So that's one sort of aspect of this. But as I said, there are a range of issues that might affect how well received and how significant the benefits are in a particular location. But all of those issues are known about. So this is a foreseeability we can see. And as I said, Professor Trish Greenhouse, I think if you want to look at some of her work, will show that she's created a sort of structured approach which we have adapted in how we think around how we support you. So it's not as simple as barriers and culture. Some of these barriers are systemic, i.e. they're part of the system. And that culture, you just have to be aware there are multifacets to the culture in terms of accountability, ultimately not only about patient safety, but also finance. So I'm going to pause briefly there, just to see if we've got any questions coming up. Great. So the question is, what if your product addresses nationwide issues as opposed to local ones? Well, our preference is going to be towards those solutions that address a national problem. If you remember those metrics, the figures we're reporting to the Office for Life Science, but also later on will have an impact and reported to NHS England. The scale of the impact if it's going to be national, then it's clearly going to have a greater impact. And it may well be that if you're dealing with a very specific local issue and your intervention can't be generalized to other areas, it's possible that you will not be supported as well, because we have to focus on where is the biggest impact. So we do look for who's got something that's going to go ideally nationally and potentially internationally. So next question, can the academic health science networks also help with healthcare economics? Some can, yes. So depending on what your level of help is. We can help most can help direct you towards someone who can. So I think that's, as a basic, we can signpost you to those that can. About 4 or 5 AHSNs, including Kent, Surrey and Sussex, but also I believe in Imperial, Oxford, Manchester, I think have in-house teams. I know that there is interest in developing these in-house teams. We've seen a significant recognition and demand for better sort of real world validation, and that may have elements of economic assessment within it. So we can help. Perhaps more importantly is helping in the gap analysis and recommending how you might close those gaps so that when you look at your health economics that you're taking all the issues into account. Next question is, what about solutions that address across health and care? So we still, although we have a Department of Health and Social Care, and we see in varying degrees joined up working locally, and the creation in recent years of integrated care systems, initially sustainable transformation partnerships. We haven't necessarily seen the pace of change and the pace of joining up. And this probably comes back slightly to the accountability issue. Those organisations still are being held to account individually. And therefore, sometimes, I think this was reported in the press around Bristol, there were some differences across the area. And actually, it does need, when you're independent organisations, people to agree to where and how that money is spent and how you get, in effect, integrated commissioning. But I believe that is making progress, and the upcoming Health and Care Act that Simon Stevens has been looking for will help move that on again. In terms of endorsements, so the question is, our market are local councils, but to succeed in attracting the council, we need NHS endorsement. Our product has national benefits. Is it possible to seek this type of endorsement? I would phrase it slightly differently. The NHS tends not to endorse things. It might tell a good story about what it's done, but will often shy away from something that may be seen as giving a commercial advantage. So it's a slightly different language, which may end up with the same benefit. If you are going through this process and you need the NHS to support or to give good account of, then the best thing to do would be to involve them early on and to help them see where the benefits are. So I'm assuming this will be in a situation where by improving local authority services, there is a benefit to the NHS. If the local NHS is part of the development of those services, including the monitoring and confirming that those benefits have been realised, then they will, I'm sure, happily tell that story. It's more about the validation of it rather than the endorsement of it. So maybe that's a semantic issue. So a very more technical question, where can I get examples of evidence needed or health metrics? This would probably be, my gut feeling is early on in your journey, to make sure you're talking to and have engaged with a range of clinicians, and how those clinicians describe the outcomes and benefits is probably going to be a good indication. And then you might then be looking at one of the more formal sort of commercial opportunities with or without an AHSN around how would you measure those specific health benefits. NICE, maybe the NICE Scientific Advice group may be a group of people to call upon. So I think, without knowing the specifics of your intervention, I'm afraid I'm giving a bit of a vague answer, but if we were to engage later on and look at specifically what you're doing, we may be able to be more specific and find the right people for you to talk to. Next question, does the AHSN prefer digital innovations or will they consider medical devices? What I think you're going to hear later on when we get into a bit about real world validation and your value proposition is we're actually less interested in what it is. We're much more interested, and the users and buyers are going to be much more interested in what impact it delivers. So I don't think there is a preference around the technology. I think there is a huge number. The barrier of entry for being a digital company is much lower than a medical device company. So unsurprisingly, we are seeing many more digital companies. But I don't think it's around it's because it's digital. I think it's about, think a bit about what it is that it's going to do. And when we talk about the value proposition, we would encourage you not to talk about your technology, but to talk about and focus on the benefits. Right, I'm going to press on with the slides, and then we've got time at the end, potentially right at the end of the session, to talk more and deal with more questions. So going back to that, what's our intervention? What our support? So one aspect of our support is around rounding off the evidence, real world validation. What do we mean by this? So that sort of real world element is going to be typically gathered post-regulatory, but as or pre-national scaling. Often you're still learning as you're starting to scale. So that sort of real world validation occurs in that sort of stage, quite a broad range of that journey. Importantly, on the bottom half of this slide, the difference is early on, your confidence to spend money on a large scale uncontrolled trial is going to be less. So you're more likely to do small scale, very well controlled, and for regulatory, it typically needs to be very well controlled evaluations. We are much more interested in the large scale, not controlled, or where there is less control, typically where it's going to be delivered at a service or a good proxy for a service level, so that there is not just the evidence, but the insights. How did people use it? What were their issues with using it? What were the technical challenges around it? How did you go about engaging? What were the clinical champions interested in? That sort of much more pragmatic side of it. So we're much more interested in the latter stage. Real world evaluation or real world validation shouldn't just be assumed it's for everyone. And we are talking nationally about how we as AHSNs would go about this, and are looking to introduce a sort of best practice, building on what's happening in some AHSNs already, but making sure we have a more standard approach. So the important thing is, and this is starting to get into how to avoid pilotitis, is making sure that the intervention is really wanted. So demonstrating, confirming that that there is market pull, there is demand for, someone has articulated and accepted there is a need for, whatever the right words are, your intervention. So the fact that your product might work and may even be affordable does not guarantee that people will put aside the time and effort to adopt it. So the first criteria we'll be looking for is it sufficiently desirable? And is it going to potentially going to gain the scale and spread that you expect? And then there are going to be other criteria in terms of, even if it's desirable, are there enough organisations that will be able to afford it? And even if it's affordable, is the implementation credible? So that's the sort of high level criteria. Real world validation isn't necessarily going to be for everyone, particularly if consuming resources of academic health science networks. The sorts of outputs, I talked earlier about this being more pragmatic. So these are the sorts of insights or evidence that might be complementing your early stage, your earlier stages of more technical evaluation, where you might have measured the per patient benefit. Now we're looking at, well, what does it mean when you scale it up? And these are the sorts, this is from working on some of the national programs, the rapid uptake programs and the innovation technology program. Companies who produced these insights, had this information available, went far faster than those that didn't. So we know that these do make a difference. So very practical insight helping people to understand, and there are other aspects around that sort of engagement and planning that would complement this. So what we're really talking about is not so much evidence, but really around how do you build confidence. And I think this morning we had a few questions that asked about evidence, including overseas evidence. So the left-hand side is typically what we would say may work, but the right-hand side is more likely to work. So by borrowed evidence, you might have heard, and it might be good evidence around a particular type of intervention, but the actual evidence was not produced with your product, it was a competitor product. You might be able to borrow some of that evidence, but it would be more convincing if you have done an evaluation that's directly used your product, your intervention. And so you can work through these elements. And then towards the bottom, evidence at small scale, we're saying evidence at service level. This is back into the sort of real world validation. One example may work, but more examples are going to work even better. And perhaps critically around that, insight gathering. The story you tell on your own when you don't have a real world test site, a demonstrator site, is just less convincing. The site where there are people able to say, and you've written up your demonstrator, your case study, it's more likely to be more convincing. Lost my train briefly then. Okay, so talk a little bit about pilotitis. So we hear a lot of concern around pilotitis in the NHS. And I think it again goes back to, we can probably foresee what is going wrong and can probably assess whether or not you've done something, or more likely to be haven't done something or done it well enough that is leading to continual requests for, or an expectation that you will undertake more evaluations, pilots, whatever you want to call them, and it not leading to more contracts. And this is more likely to come from one or more of the following. So just really sort of relatively straightforward stuff. Not assessing correctly the gaps in evidence or insights. So not understanding what do buyers and users want to know. And the only way to know that is to go and talk to them. So market research is fundamental to avoiding pilotitis. Going actually and studying the market, going and asking enough people. Because of that earlier slide I showed you, the NHS is different everywhere. If you've only spoken to a small number of sites, the risk is you've developed something that will only work in a small number of sites and won't be generalizable. And as you try and generalize it, you'll be asked to do more and more evaluations. So all of those sorts of issues are really around being thorough or sufficiently thorough and ensuring that you have the user and buyer in mind as you undertake an evaluation. And a simple guide of avoiding doing the wrong evaluation is confirming that if you do this evaluation, how do you know it's going to lead to more uptake? And if you don't ask that question before you set out, it is highly likely you're going to do an evaluation that is probably going to be repeated or is going to be built on with more evaluations later. I hope that will stir a few questions. So briefly then going back to what's the sort of building block that leads to doing this better in the first place. So I'm talking about value proposition. There isn't a sort of universally accepted definition, but it's basically how you tell your story, importantly, from that buyer perspective. If you get this wrong, and we accept that the NHS is difficult to understand, if you don't know how the NHS is structured, if you don't know how it's financed, there's a high chance that you are not going to be able to produce a value proposition that is sufficient to get the impact you want it to. So there's a way that we, and increasingly more AHSNs, are constructing and then deconstructing value propositions. So apart from the context, there might be 5 elements. It's a bit of context describing key background information, focusing down then on what is the inherent problem, what's the root cause of the problem. So it should be relatively clear. This is the root cause and the problem that it creates, the consequence that creates. Then moving into the sort of solution side, describing the intervention, and the impact. Remember I said at the beginning, people are more interested in not the technology, but it's really around the impact. But the intervention is going to be much more than just it's a technology, it's a digital, or it's a med tech. It's going to describe how people are onboarded. It may have elements in your value proposition that cover patient service and national. It doesn't mean to say you're going to have 12 elements, a lot of them probably in the top half, but importantly that service element. So potentially elements from each of those boxes as necessary to be convincing. When we hear these stories from you, what we hear is usually a very strong and clear patient level understanding of the benefits. What is typically absent is that service level. And again, because it's if you don't understand who the buyer is, why would you know that? So often this is absent. And then usually a legacy of a pitch to an investor. You've got unrealistic expectations of how it will go nationally, if not internationally. And then on the intervention, we often hear people talking about the technology, not the intervention. And then in terms of the impact, people will often talk about the outcomes, what it can do, as opposed to what difference it will make. So in getting you to tell this story, first thing is we can then start to identify the gaps in that story and may be able to guide you as to the sort of things you need to look at to close those gaps. Once you've closed those gaps, then the issue will be around asking more and more questions around where's the evidence that backs it up. So just laying out your value proposition. This is a simple guide that we give people to start with. We often take a number of iterations, may take 3 or 4 goes at this, trying to describe, answering those questions. Once you've got your narrative, that value proposition with a narrative, which may have some high level figures in, what we're then probably looking at is the numbers in more detail, or what we might call a budget impact model. So looking at budget impact model, the numbers behind the story. This is something that will help both buyer and seller. It is like the value proposition, it's an aid to engagement. By documenting things, by being clear about what you're talking about, it will help the conversation go in the right direction. If you're working with academic health science networks, it will help the story be consistent. As you grow your company, it'll be helpful within your company to keep the consistent story, make sure people are telling the right sort of story. Story and narrative, story and numbers. It will help people to point out where the details are wrong, where are the assumptions right or wrong. These are going to be pretty unique because most innovations are unique. It's helpful to create your budget impact model by those silos and by year, and typically separating out pay and non-pay, because pay and non-pay typically behave differently. So linking future, not just future costs, but showing how current and future costs are linked, making sure there aren't any hidden costs omitted, training, license maintenance, all that sort of thing. There's probably going to be a transition cost. We've seen this with a variety of things where in order to get the implementation, there might be a pump priming cost that actually helps services in and around the intervention to accommodate this change. And then there might be elements of monitoring, supporting the engagement. This might come down to academic health science networks supporting you. What's going to be the cost of training and education, engagement? Producing that data that shows that to those people who are just using it, an important part of this, showing them that it has made the difference is often a very important way of making sure they continue to use that intervention. This process is iterative, so the development of your value proposition may continue to change over the whole life cycle of the product, but you're going to get through iterations closer and closer until you think it's ready for market research. Alongside your market research to confirm your value proposition and that people recognise the problem, believe in the intervention and are interested in the benefits, we would then start to have those business conversations with you. Importantly, though, that sort of value proposition is a stage gate. So we would not be introducing AHSNs generally will not introduce you to carefully developed contacts in their local patch. until they have an idea of what it is you have and what it is you want from that engagement. They're not going to act as your sales team and simply provide a conduit to you. So there is a degree of working through AHSNs is you'll have to give them some information to help them to work with you. Hopefully that sort of gives you a high level view of the process. So we're looking for those stars. We know that stars go faster if they've got a rounding of the evidence. We're typically involved in that late stage evidence gathering, not the early stage, but we might signpost to you. That evidence gathering has to be based on a clear value proposition. So we will be typically involved in helping to clarify that value proposition. But that value proposition isn't just around that technical, does it work? You need to be testing out, does the market want it? And then have you assessed, does the market want it enough that you have a viable business behind you? Those are the sorts of stages and tests. So I've got a few minutes left, which I'll see if we can go back to some of the questions. So question at the top here. Where's the best place to find a pilot to show the benefits of your product? It's probably not a best place, it's probably places, and the places are going to be the areas in which you believe your product has its impact. There are potentially within, if we go back to one of the key criteria is making sure that the place you're doing your evaluation actually is very interested in your product. For those undertaking later stage evaluations, we would expect that there is some degree of sign up and possibly some degree of early cost sharing. If not a commitment and or a contract in place, particularly at the later stage, so assuming it meets the KPIs you're claiming, the benefits that you're claiming or proxies, that you will then be able to invoice that organisation. So those are the best places to do it. They want it and are prepared to sign up to it. Next question is, who should we contact initially to start a dialogue? Well, we do typically encourage people to go to their local AHSN. That just gives a more of a spread. However, AHSNs do vary slightly in terms of what they offer. And they may have focused on a different portfolio of priorities. So your local AHSN may be the best place to start, but don't be surprised or concerned if they refer you on to a different AHSN. So I might refer, if someone was doing point of care diagnostics, I might refer them on to Oxford because I know they've done more work in that space. If they're digital, I know that Manchester has been running Accelerator. I know their chief officer is particularly interested in this. Excuse me. So I know that we have preferences. Hopefully your local AHSN will be able to guide you to who the best one for you might be. If you're an international company, to which local AHSN do we suggest we approach? It might depend on your ability and desire to future locations. So there might be something about post-pandemic when we can have face-to-face meetings, thinking about as you land in the UK, where do you want to know, where are you likely to land? And again, time is money. You're more likely to want to create a relationship with somewhere where you can have those face-to-face discussions, or you've already got some sort of reason for being there. I don't think it makes a difference. Again, we're probably back to where's the best place to do it. Depends on what support you need, what stage you're at, and whether there's an existing cluster of research or innovation in an area that you can tap into. How can one gain the test site references you mentioned when NHS will not engage? There might be two different questions in here, or two elements to this. If they're not engaging with you, they're telling you they're not interested. So step away, and we might want to help you to figure out why they won't engage with you, if you're talking about engaging in order to. So that's something we may want to discuss with you. Make sure you've got things. You may have simply not presented what you've got well enough. And that might come back to your value proposition or being clear about what you're asked. Because remember, today, I think we've got over 100 delegates. In a year, we've got 2,500 that we deal with. And that is a fraction of the number of companies engaging with the NHS. For the NHS, they can't tell the difference between a good innovator and a not so good innovator. But they may make judgments based on how well you tell your story. If your story is poor to start with, they may just think you're going to need too much support, you're not ready, you don't know what you're talking about, and they won't engage with you. Hence why we go back to the importance of the value proposition. The test site reference part of the question, it's not necessarily a reference, it's more of a case study. You've produced the insights. Those are insights that will speak for themselves. So it's not really a reference. People might not just sign up to sending a reference through. What they're more likely to do is contribute to, and might not mind being quoted on, a document that is a case study that reflects well both on the use of the product and their organisation. And again, that's something we can potentially advise and support you on. Where could one find the AHSN adoption and spread plan? I'm not sure I know what that means. So if Aditi, if you could clarify that in terms of the adoption and spread plan. If you mean how we go about preparing the information, then we have a template which again lists lots of questions, and that's what that might be what you mean in terms of the adoption plan. Is this is filling gaps in insights and knowledge that will help us to communicate with potential users and buyers. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that stimulated your interest in AHSNs and has given you a bit of an insight as to why we exist and the sorts of things we may be able to do to support you. That's in AHSNs, but we are only a part of the innovation landscape. Rachael Troughton in the Accelerated Access Collaborative in a moment is now going to talk about the wider offering and how that's being developed to support you access even more resources.
Thanks very much, Rob. Hope you can all hear me okay, and I will just share my slides. Right, so that should be available for you all to see now. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rachael Troughton, and I work at the Accelerated Access Collaborative, which is based at NHS England and NHS Improvement. And the project that I work on is called the Innovation Service. I'll just swap my screens around so I'm looking at you. So the Accelerated Access Collaborative is an umbrella term for all of the organisations that are involved in the health innovation landscape in the UK. So it includes patient organisations, government bodies, industry representation, and a number of NHS bodies as well. And the aim of the Accelerated Access Collaborative is to get those promising innovations into the NHS faster so that patients and the health service, the wider health service, can all benefit. The reason that this was born really is because there are a number of issues in the health innovation landscape at the moment, which some of these might resonate with you, and these are all identified firstly in the Accelerated Access Review, and then a landscape review following on from that. So these are mostly fragmented innovator support, so there's duplication of existing information, there's an absence of an agreed pathway from having an idea all the way through to successful adoption in the NHS. There's a lack of clarity on regulation and evidence generation and the associated resources for those. And that's particularly with regards to novel technologies, and it causes lots of delays for innovators. There's dispersed funding pots, and there's too many providers that have small funding pots, and there's no real clear priorities or clear kind of strategy across all of those. There's also limited evidence of handover between support infrastructure and organisations and the funding schemes as well. And what that can mean is that if an innovator is not handed over successfully from one funding scheme or from an organisation to another, they end up just falling down the gaps. there's also no clear way of articulating need from the health and care sector, and that results in innovators not always developing the right solutions for the problems that are faced. And finally, convoluted procurement processes. There's limited standardization, and it's particularly difficult for SMEs to navigate. And especially if you have only ever been a patient in the NHS and not worked in it, you might not realize that people say often now that there's no such thing as the NHS. Next slide, please. Now I feel like Boris Johnson now. Or Chris Whitty. Chris Whitty. So because of all of those issues, the Secretary of State created the Accelerated Access Collaborative and gave them a number of priorities. And the first of which is the creation of a single front door to the innovation ecosystem, which is envisaged as an online portal with information and support and signposting that links to existing teams and provides more detailed advice on the aspects of the innovation pipeline. So that's just one of the 6 main priorities of the innovation of the Accelerated Access Collaborative. I'm part of the AAC team, and although it's an umbrella organisation with lots of involvement from a number of partners, it's based and hosted at NHS England and NHS Improvement, so that's where I work. So next slide, please. So the overall vision of the innovation service is that it will be the go-to place for innovators to navigate the path to market, and that it will coordinate organisational partners in accelerating the best products to market. Next slide, please. So that vision's great, but I just want to outline who this innovation service is for. So we kind of have a core target user group. Then we have a group of people who we think the innovation service will actually be still useful for. And then there are a couple of things which the innovation service isn't aimed at. So we think the core group is really going to be clinical innovators, NHS staff, people in industry and SMEs. But we also think it will be useful for academics, patients and individuals. So ultimately, it's for anybody that has an innovative healthcare product or idea or service that they're working on. In terms of the types of innovations, it will cover everything really from medical devices, digital, AI, diagnostics, all the way through to things like services and models of care. We don't think it will be as useful for people working with pharmaceuticals, mostly just because they already kind of have a very clear pathway, and it's unusual for them to need a lot of help navigating that. But we do think it will be useful. We're not excluding pharmaceuticals, and we do think it will be useful, particularly in areas where there's very novel, very new kind of transformative medicines, things like kind of like advanced immunotherapies and things like that. So in terms of the stage of innovations, it will cover everything from ideas all the way through development and scale. We think it might be useful for people doing basic research if they've identified something through their basic research that they think could be a promising innovation further down the line. But we aren't aiming the service at established products that are just looking to increase their market share. And finally, the where. So we are intending for the service to cover the whole of the UK. At the moment, we've been focusing mostly on England because we're NHS England and it's easiest to just start from what you know. But we do have good links in with Wales, and we are creating stronger links in with Scotland and Northern Ireland. So we do have a strong intention to make this a UK-wide project. It will also be useful for international companies who are interested in coming to the UK. But because it's all about the NHS and the UK health system, we're not looking for UK companies who are just looking to move abroad. So hopefully that outlines what the innovation service is for and who it's for. Next slide, please, Rob. But now I want to kind of give you a little bit of the story so far. So we started working on this project back in summer 2019. We started with our discovery phase. And the key findings from that were that an online service would solve some of the key issues that were identified through that literature review and through the Accelerated Access Review, and that the service would need both informational and transactional elements. We then moved on to our alpha stage, and we looked at what's already out there and what some of the options would be, and we decided that it would be good to transition from Health Tech Connect, which is an existing transactional platform for innovators, and turn that ultimately eventually into the innovation service. But that we'd reuse a lot of the data sharing models and a lot of the concepts from Health Tech Connect and just build on that with the informational section, and also kind of revamp the transactional elements as well. So then we took those ideas forward and explored them further in an extended alpha. So we now have, at the end of last year, we came up with a proposed user journey, and we also settled on having a phased delivery of starting with content and then delivering the full transactional service. So we began work on our beta phase, and we've done a lot of building recently, starting in January this year. So we're really building this in earnest now. Next slide, please, Rob. So as well as doing lots and lots of building, we've also done a huge amount of research with key users. We really want to make sure that this service is going to work for the people who are using it, both from the innovators side and also the people providing the services on the back end. We're not intending to launch any new support for innovators. The concept behind the innovation service is just to link up and join up all of the services and the support that already exists for innovators, because there is a huge amount out there. So we've done over 50 interviews with innovators, and that goes up every week, that figure. And we've also done a lot of work, interviews and workshops with the accessing organisations, including Rob, on behalf of the AHSNs, and as well as research with innovators and accessors. We've also got quite a strong focus on accessibility. We want to design this service to be accessible to all kinds of innovators. So people who use screen readers, screen magnifiers, who have difficulty with certain colours and things like that. So that this really is a tool for everybody. Next slide, please. So the key findings from all of that research are that on the informational side, innovators want a single source of information that they know is up to date and that is really trustworthy. They want that information to be easy to find, to be relevant, and to help them take action. So not just to kind of wishy-washy, but actually what do I need to know? What do I need to do now? It needs to include information on regulations, evidence and testing, what the NHS needs, funding, and also procurement and intellectual property. And it came across really strongly that innovators are also looking for case studies that they can relate to, that illustrate those key challenges and those pitfalls that Rob alluded to earlier, and how others have tackled those. On the transactional side, innovators really need a single front door where organisations can see a single shared record, much like an electronic patient record that kind of stays with that innovation and grows over time. Sorry, my computer's locked me out. Not my day. They also want clarity around who is on the other end of the transaction and what help is on offer. And alongside that, also responsiveness and transparency. We want to ensure that there are no black holes for innovators. They don't feel like they're just kind of like sending something off and waving it off and then never hear back what anybody thought of it. We also know it's important to have proof points, again, like case studies, but also maybe comments from high profile figures, just to make sure that they are definitely putting their information in something that is a legitimate site. And then some general findings, that innovators rely a lot on their networks and often go to them directly rather than Googling for information or leads. And that's the case now. That might change when we launch the innovation service, but it's definitely important for us to know now for our comms strategy. We also know that some innovators want to read lots of information and others want to dive straight into having a transaction and a conversation with somebody. And that's not always necessarily dependent on, you know, what stage they're at, if they're early or late. So we need to cater for everybody's needs. And there's also no single linear journey for innovators to follow, and that all innovators and innovations will need different support at different times. And that might be able to be given in parallel to help speed up that journey. Next slide, please. So you might find some of these familiar. These are some of the choice quotes from our user research. So there is so much within the NHS to support startups, but we couldn't find, or at least I couldn't find, one single place on how to navigate through it. Couple of comments about when you find the right person, they give you all of the answers you need in half an hour. And then some of the quotes from our testing of our prototypes. So somebody saying, this is exactly the sort of information I'm looking for, and someone saying, my heart would lift if I was looking at this. So we're definitely along the right lines with our development of the innovation service. Next slide, please. So in terms of the functionality, I mentioned before that we've got the informational side and the transactional side. I don't think I want to linger too long on this slide, but just to go through the informational side, the basic guide, there's going to be a basic guide, which is a kind of introduction to all the things that you will need to think about at some point in your journey. And we'll also have a detailed guide that expands on all of those sections and really gives you the information that you need about how to present your evidence. And that's kind of going to help structure thinking for conversations later down the line with some of these organisations that can provide support. Another key part of the innovation service will also be that demand signalling piece. So articulating what the NHS is actually looking for and what the NHS needs. And that's actually another key work stream for the AAC. So there's a whole team working on that piece at the moment, and we'll be hosting all of their outputs on the innovation service. And finally, signposting to relevant opportunities. And on the transactional element, you may have heard before that I mentioned a service called Health Tech Connect that already exists, and that's hosted by NICE. You can sign up there and put your information in there, and all of these organisations whose logos you can see there, you can choose to share that with them and access support through them. And the Academic Health Science Network is on there as well. And that allows multiple organisations working within innovators to coordinate their support. So we'll be keeping that model from Health Tech Connect. There's a couple of extra accessing organisations that will be adding in NHSX and MHRA. The MHRA Innovation Office will be joining as well. And so we'll be building on that foundation started by Health Tech Connect, and then creating a much more collaborative workspace for all of those organisations to support innovators. Next slide, please, Rob. Okay, so we move on now to the real detailed user journey. We start off, I think if you press next, we can actually, it should, very fancy, zoom into this pathway. There we go. So an innovator coming onto this service would land first on the landing page. And this has, it kind of orientates the user and explains what the service can do. This will also host the NHS needs piece as well. But the key part from this page is that it will enable you to click through to find the right support for your innovation. Next slide, please. So what that means is it's a short questionnaire, basically, where you don't put in any, there's no free text, you don't put in any kind of personal information or any information that's very specific to your innovation. It's basic things like, what category of innovation do you have? Is it a medical device? Is it digital? Those types of questions. And some questions to try and place what stage you're at. And that will ultimately lead, next slide, please, to one of two information packs. So it will either direct you to the starter innovation guide or to the more detailed one. And you can also, if you get recommended one and you think, actually, I'd prefer the other, you can go and read either, whichever one you want. But so that information is for everybody, and it's to help structure your thinking and structure what you're planning to do. So as I said, this part is going to be launched first. And at the end of that section, as well as directing you to one of the two information packs, it will eventually also invite you to create an account, which is the next slide. So then, yeah, so you'll then be able to create an account. And what that means is once you've created an account, you can register your innovation and you can fill in much more detailed information about that. Next slide, please, Rob. From your innovators dashboard. So we've done a lot of work on this recently, and all of these are screenshots from prototypes. So we're not actually near launching this yet. So, but you can see here the innovators dashboard. There's actions, there's comments or messages, there's kind of a progress indicator bar. There's some really clear steps of things that you can do next. And this is where you would put in and start creating your innovation record. So it's very, very structured. There's set sections, and that will also enable, if we skip to the next slide, please. Here's the innovation record. You can see those structured sections there. And next to each one of those is a kind of completed, under review, a kind of a status indicator of where you're at with that section. And it's not just you completing that section. Skip to the next slide, please. Because on the back end are a number of those accessing organisations, and they are able to view incoming submissions and create actions, leave comments, and really help you to work up your innovation record and make sure that every section that you fill in is high quality and help you to get that up to scratch. So that's the kind of overview generally of the pathway that you would follow. And so it won't just be one accessor. There could be multiple accessors from different organizations working with you to work on your innovation record and build up that evidence. But as I said, none of this is going to be new support or new services. It's exactly the kind of things that are already provided by AHSNs. It will be the evaluation programs that are run by NICE. It could be help from NIHR on creating, setting up a clinical trial. It might be that you might want to talk to MHRA and just check that you're following the right regulations for your innovation. And all the way down at the other end, NHS supply chain may want to view your innovation and consider if that needs to be included in an upcoming procurement framework. So all of this is already happening in the system, but it would just happen through the innovation service and stop you from having to approach each of these organizations separately and having to update them when anything changes. Next slide, please. So the expected benefits of the innovation service for patients are that there would be faster access to promising innovations. All of these efficiencies in helping accessors work more collaboratively together should introduce efficiencies and help innovators make progress faster. It will also, because of the demand signalling and the NHS needs articulation, help to just develop better innovations that better meet the needs of users. And having an overview of the innovation pipeline would enable us to rapidly respond to emerging needs. So one of the quotes on the earlier slides was, think where we would have been with COVID if we'd had this, because we would have basically had a repository of all of the innovations currently being worked on, and those could have been accelerated. So the benefits for innovators are reduced duplication of effort in completing paperwork, reduced time spent knocking on doors, streamlined support and forward planning, and the ability to create actions and monitor your progress better. And for the accessors, it would be, again, reduced duplication of effort, but this time between them providing the same support or the same advice to innovators, and also the ability to create actions and monitor progress on the other side as well, and facilitated collaborative working. Again, having an overview of the whole pipeline, but from their portfolio's perspective is really helpful and leads to easier reporting. So there's benefits for everybody. Next slide, please. Just to clarify how this fits with all the existing services, so it will build on, as I mentioned, the shared record service that's currently provided by Health Tech Connect that will eventually be decommissioned. It links for the first time with the MHRA Innovation Office and with the NHSX Digital Technology Assessment Criteria, which is the new digital standards that have been released. It will replace a shared legacy database, which is used by the AHSN network, which will help them with reporting mostly. It improves the processes to feed innovations into NHS supply chain. It will signpost to services like the AHSN Innovation Exchange, which has lots of information, including funding information. And it also connects with existing AHSN's customer relationship management systems. That's a long-term goal. Next slide, please. So our next steps are to publish the basic information pack. We're hoping that will go up in the next couple of months, so that would be available for everybody to view. Following on from that, we'll also need to propose some processes for the accesses for reviewing submitted innovations, who's going to be responsible for what, those types of questions, which is very complex, as you can imagine. And defining the rules of engagement, what are the expected turnaround times, those types of things, and developing the detailed information pack as well. And our plan for the longer term will be, we need to think about how we're going to keep the information up to date. We need to think about how we're going to add in new accesses, which is the plan. We need to think about different types of functionality. It's possible we might be able to allow people to apply for funding and things through this service, but that's kind of on the horizon. Adding in other accesses, more teams from devolved nations and more local bodies as well. And finally, exploring how NHS providers could use the service. That's been one of the major things that we've had to pause because of COVID. We haven't been able to consider how NHS providers like CCGs, GPs, or trusts, how they might want to interact with this service. So at the moment they're kind of not involved, which is a bit of a drawback at the moment, but hopefully when things recover from COVID, that will be high on our priority list. Next slide, please. So yeah, finally, probably the bit that you're all most interested in is the timeline. So as I said, we're doing the beta build at the moment. We're doing a lot of user testing, and our plan is to go live with public beta in sort of June, July time, so later on this year, with what will be our kind of minimum viable product for this. So it won't be all singing and dancing, but we hope it will have most of the key functionality there. The last slide, I just wanted to do a little bit of a plug for getting involved in our user research. So you saw earlier on my earlier slide that we've had more than 50 interviews so far with innovators. We're always on the lookout for more innovators to speak to review our content, to test our prototypes, and it's really key that we get as many different types of people as possible, so as many diverse opinions as we can, to kind of work through the prototypes. And some of the things that we've already changed thanks to innovators' feedback are things like rewriting the regulations section in our information pack. We've made the innovators dashboard more action oriented, and we've swapped some of the question formats from choose one to select all that apply. Those are just some of the insights that we've had. So if you're interested in taking part in our user research to help the development of this, there's a link there. You can also follow the AAC on Twitter, and you can also follow me on Twitter, because I tweet this link out periodically, and yeah, sometimes you get updates through there as well. So I'm sorry I've rambled on, and I'm sorry I had some technical hitches. And I haven't been monitoring the chat. But yeah, shall I see if there's any questions?
There are quite a few, Rachel, towards the bottom. So it might be worth spending a little bit of time, first of all, starting at the bottom end. I think those are more relevant to the innovator service. I think some of them you've actually answered as the questions have come up. You've actually answered a few of them.
So the question about funding opportunities, is there a centralized list of funding opportunities or calls? So the AHSN Exchange already has a lot of funding calls. That's one of the most centralized lists that I know of. We have also got another couple of resources that we are hoping to include in the pages in the information pack. So yeah, we will be signposting to funding opportunities. The next one, there's no free text at initial registration. Are you saying one size fits all? So the no free text part is for the very, very early kind of triage questions, which choose which pack is best for you. It's just to give an indication of which pack would be the most appropriate for you, not necessarily which one. But then when you register, that is the point when you will put in all of the free text that you want about your innovation, but it will be in a very structured format to kind of help you articulate the various different sections. So definitely not one size fits all. And the ultimate, the reasoning behind the innovation service is that information can only go so far before you then need to interact with somebody. So what's the difference between, I might be jumping around here, sorry.
That's a good one. The difference between the AHSN and the innovation service. I thought that was a good, just to double check on.
Yes. So the innovation service is a door through which you can access all of the other services that are available for innovators, including all the support offered by the AHSNs, but also others like NICE, like NIHR. Sorry, so many acronyms here. National Institute for Health Research, like MHRA, the regulators, who else? NHS supply chain. There's a huge amount of support on the back end, and AHSNs are part of that. So I hope that answers that question. What validation and user trials have been done with the new innovation service? So unfortunately, we aren't able, there's very, very limited data about how long it actually takes to progress an innovation from start to finish at the moment. So it's very difficult. It's going to be very difficult for us to prove that the innovation service is going to reduce that, but it is definitely in terms of the amount of collaboration, it's going to be revolutionary, we hope. But as I said, we've been doing a huge amount of research with both innovators and the accessing organisations on the back end as well to make sure that it's going to meet everybody's needs. A timeline. I shared the timeline, so I hope that one's done. Yes, I think I've done most. The last one that I can see that's relevant to the innovation service is how does IP protection coincide with the accesses? So there will be some guidance in the basic pack and then later the detailed pack once we've written it that describes different IP protections. But the innovations, in order for all of the accesses to view any of the information in there, they'll have to sign up with the terms of use. And innovators will also be able to toggle which organizations they can share their data with. So if you're not comfortable sharing your innovation record with a particular accessing organization, you can change that. So that's all come about from our work with users, because we know that privacy is obviously a really important issue. I think I'm out of time. So I'll hand back to Rob. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rachel. That was very helpful. So we've got a few more minutes, and I don't mind staying on a bit long because I know helpful to answer as many questions as possible and to make sure that innovators know where to go to next. So hopefully you've made a note in your email about the invite for today. Those of you who are interested in that sort of later stage real world validation, there are 2 sessions on, one run by Eastern AHSN, one run by Oxford, one looking at digital and AI, one looking at diagnostic. That will give you a sense of what's this like in practice. Those are the examples that will back up. So hopefully you'll look at those. Whilst I'm going to introduce Russ Watkins. Russ Watkins is the commercial director at North East North Cumbria AHSN, and you might have heard quite a lot of coincidence or overlap between the innovator service and the academic health science networks, and that's because we are in effect morphing. We're growing from existing services into something that's going to be more comprehensive, and Russ has been our link man from the AHSN network, spending a lot of time in supporting the innovator service to ensure that we're building on, complementing and growing this offer. So I wonder if Russ is ready to answer a few questions.
Answer some questions if you like, Rob. My video's not working, but I can answer. Would you like me to answer any in particular?
Can you scoot through? Can you see the questions?
Yes, I can see them. Yeah.
If you pick out a few that you'd like to answer that you think you do well on.
Yeah. So there's a question, I guess, about the NICE meta tool and what you need to pay for and what you don't. We're aware that I guess within the wider offer within I guess the innovation support, there are a few different variances around what is offered for free and what is offered as a pay for service. A couple of the NICE services are pay for services. We're currently talking to NICE about how we might integrate some of the meta tool into the National Innovation Service, but also how the AHSNs and NICE work together on utilising what they've already developed and see if we can provide that with a slightly different way of delivering it. So at the moment, some of the services are paid for and some of them are for free. Over time, and once the innovation services launch, that will become a lot more clearer, I think, for innovators. So
Right.
we can pick that up again if necessary, Rob. Are we at odds with private market access health economics companies, or are we offering similar services? It's a really good question. Some of it will come down to what your preferences are as innovators. We do access, and we may access even the same health economic companies that you might go privately to. So across the different AHSNs, we'll have relationships with health economic companies, and we do that in partnership with them. So it's quite a difficult question to answer without knowing what is behind the question, really. I don't think we're at odds with any of that. We provide advice and guidance around what you would need to do to get your health economics, and then we could normally work with our local providers around that to see if we can do that in conjunction.
I'll build on that if I can, Russ. I think this is around the sort of pilotitis issue again.
Okay.
So we get a lot of companies who do evaluations with commercial companies. The NHS has continually evolved and has constantly changing needs and expectations. One of the benefits of using an AHSN, who may in turn direct you towards a commercial company, is that added insight of what is important to evaluate and what you need to gather. So whether the AHSN is a conduit or is the deliverer of that evaluation, they are in a better position because of our proximity and relationships with the local health and care system to provide, in many cases, better advice. But we're not competing. We're not deliberately looking to compete with private providers. We're looking to ensure, as hopefully you've heard from a lot of this presentation, we recognise there are challenges for innovators. So a number of services are being developed because ultimately there is a potential cost to patients, to the efficiency of the health system and to the economy if we didn't address some of these issues. So we're there to facilitate in a very neutral way. Another name we have is the honest broker. We want people to succeed because they should succeed. And through no fault of their own, might just not know what success needs to look like and how to identify it. So I think it's a complement to what is out there commercially. AHSNs do not provide all services for free though. So there is a limit to what we can provide for free. And it may well be that your journey with us, as we develop your value proposition and develop your evidence and you develop your understanding of the market, that you are in a better position to secure private investment or can plan your finances better. So I think these are complementary approaches.
Yeah, just to build on that, Rob, you know, from our perspective, we work very closely with our health economics providers in the Northeast and North Cumbria. So we generally will talk to them about the innovations that we have and then talk with the innovator jointly around that. So that's how we kind of work with that. But there will inevitably be some costs associated with that, depending on what it is that's required. So I don't see it as being at odds. I guess there is kind of a journey there that we provide part of that journey. I think you've covered some of the where to start. So the Innovation Exchange is probably the best place to start, whether you're internationally or not. Come and find who your local AHSN is, and you know, we'll start that journey with you. That is for me the best place to start. So that covers quite a few of the questions I think that are left, and solutions that cross over health and social care, I guess. Increasingly, certainly in the Northeast and North Cumbria, we are talking more about health and social care work rather than just the NHS. So we do quite a lot with our local authority colleagues, and I think over time that will become less of a silo. You know, the integrated care systems, when they come in to being sort of next year, you know, that will significantly reduce the siloed working between health and care. And I think we'll have to adapt alongside of that. So yes, it is a problem at the minute, but I can see over time that being reduced. I don't know, Rob, if you've got anything else to add on that.
It's part of that evolving landscape, and I think there are probably bigger issues at the moment around post-pandemic fallout. How does the NHS reset, recover, or whatever the next R word will be? So the important thing, and I'm going to go into the sort of conclusion of today. The important thing is that the NHS does change, and the assumptions often made by innovators, including multinational companies with many years of experience, is they make assumptions, and sometimes those assumptions are flawed. We recognise, the state recognise, the NHS, the Office for Life Science recognise that there are companies that fail through no fault of their own. These services are there. Certainly the initial services, advice, signposting are typically free. They're subsidised. They're there to help guide you, to get you onto the right journey to find those insights. So the important thing, I think, if you've found today helpful, is keep in touch, dip in and out of what's going on with AHSNs, look out for that innovator service when it's launched, take advantage of your local AHSN, get into a discussion, find out what you don't know, de-risk your business, And I wish you luck, and I've no doubt we will see many of you in the future. And thank you again for listening today.